Yes. Ja, what stressing. You're not going to need Huh? Put the books, get them. Because you're my hunter. Someone messes with you, they mess with you. If it's time to show them the kind of you have to show.
Honey?
It's my kid's sister. She just broke up with her boyfriend and was thinking about dropping out of law school.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I agree.
Really? Well, nothing to be sorry about. That's the way it is with men and women, isn't it? Why? I'm interested.
I was just trying to be agreeable. What's the way?
Nothing wrong last time. That was a problem with Honey's guy. He didn't know what he wanted, so he's fooling around.
What?
All right. I was sharpshooter. Oh, just that nothing wrong.
So you're a one-man.
She catches me. Like one girlfriend isn't enough. That's right. Looking for it right now? Yes, sir. Who knows? You might be right. Got a new job. Trying to get this car. Anyway. I'm doing that. I just got into town and this apartment building. Everyone's agreed to see your doctor.
How'd you know?
Everyone's doctor. Doctor. What kind of doctor? Slippers, green pajamas. The guy I'm waiting for to vacate.
I'm a resident of internal medicine.
You could be her. So if I needed a doctor, you could be it.
Yeah, I could. I'm working at the
Her.
hospitals.
I see. You one as well. It's a lucky day. Just get in the big bad city, not only do I find a doctor, but you mind me saying that?
Oh, yeah, of course. Absolutely. It's fine. It's fine. Just...
Make that another cup of coffee.
I have some patients coming in, so I should probably...
Still. Listen, can I buy you a coke?
Yeah, okay.
Let me do that?
Well...
Meet Joe Black begins with an idea so simple that it almost feels impossible to build a 3-hour movie around it. Death wants to understand what it means to be alive. Not conquer humanity, not punish it, not frighten it, but experience it. And that distinction is what makes the film so strange. Because this is not really a story about a supernatural being entering the human world and discovering that people are fragile. It is a story about a being who has never had to value anything, suddenly discovering that value itself may depend on the possibility of loss. William Parrish has spent 65 years surrounded by everything people usually associate with a successful life. He has money, influence, an enormous home, a thriving company, adult children, loyal employees, and a daughter he genuinely loves. From the outside, Bill's life appears almost impossibly complete. Yet the movie quietly begins dismantling that illusion almost immediately. His birthday is not simply a celebration. It is a countdown. The party is not merely a gathering of friends and business associates. It is a temporary ceremony held at the edge of an ending. And death arrives not as a monster but as a guest who has come to ask a question. If death could become human for a few days, what would it discover? Would it discover that humans are irrational, frightened, selfish creatures who spend their lives trying to escape the inevitable? Or would it discover something much stranger? That precisely because human beings die, every ordinary moment can become precious? That is the contradiction at the center of Meet Joe Black. Death possesses infinite time, yet has no idea what time means. Bill possesses limited time, yet has spent much of his life behaving as though it were unlimited. One has eternity but lacks experience. The other has experience but is about to lose eternity. And somewhere between them is Susan, a woman who believes she is falling in love with a mysterious young man, unaware that the person looking through his eyes is not the man she originally met. That complication immediately turns what could have been a straightforward fantasy romance into something morally and emotionally unstable. Can Death understand love if the body he uses once belonged to somebody else? Can Susan love a person whose identity is fundamentally impossible to define? Can Bill teach Death about humanity without confronting the ways in which he himself has failed to appreciate his own life? And perhaps most importantly, what would any of us do if we were told that our remaining time had suddenly become measurable? Meet Joe Black is an unusual film because it asks these enormous questions while frequently becoming distracted by its own enormousness. It is expensive, elegant, star-driven, philosophical, romantic, sentimental, funny, solemn, and extremely slow. Its nearly 3-hour runtime became one of its most recognizable characteristics, and for many viewers that length was not an invitation to contemplate time but a test of patience. Critics were sharply divided, and some found the movie indulgent, overextended, and emotionally awkward. Yet decades later, the film remains difficult to dismiss completely because its central question has not aged. If death appeared tomorrow and offered you a few more days, would you suddenly understand how valuable your life was? Or would you realize that you had spent years waiting for a future that never actually belonged to you? That is the question Bill Parrish is forced to confront. And the irony is that death may come to his house expecting to become the teacher, only to discover that he is the student. This analysis will move beyond simply retelling the plot. The story itself matters, but the more interesting question is why these particular events happen in this particular way. Why does Joe become fascinated by food? Why does coffee matter? Why does the film spend so much time watching people talk? Why does the enormous Parrish mansion sometimes feel like a palace and sometimes feel almost empty? Why does the romance between Susan and Joe feel beautiful in one moment and deeply uncomfortable in the next? And why does a movie that contains supernatural fantasy, corporate betrayal, romance, family drama, and philosophical reflection sometimes seem as though it is barely interested in moving the plot forward? Those questions become especially important when we consider the world in which Meet Joe Black arrived. The late 1990s were obsessed with speed, technology, celebrity, wealth, and the approaching millennium. Yet this film deliberately moves in the opposite direction. Pauses. It watches. It lets conversations continue after the practical information has already been delivered. It lingers on faces. It turns eating into an event. It treats attraction as something almost mysterious and physical. In an era increasingly fascinated by acceleration, Meet Joe Black made a movie about stopping. That can feel frustrating, but it can also explain why the film has remained fascinating to certain viewers. Modern audiences live inside an even faster culture. Messages arrive instantly. Careers are measured through productivity. Social media compresses relationships into images and reactions. Entertainment competes aggressively for attention. Even nostalgia is consumed quickly, often reduced to clips rather than experienced as a whole. Against that environment, Meet Joe Black can feel almost alien. Its scenes breathe. Sometimes they breathe too much. But that excess creates an interesting possibility. Perhaps the movie's slowness is not simply an accident of filmmaking. Perhaps it is part of the argument. A film about death forces the audience to spend time. And when viewers complain that there is too much time, the movie almost seems to answer that this is precisely the point. The problem, of course, is that intention does not automatically create effectiveness. A long film can be meditative, but it can also be merely long. A philosophical conversation can reveal character, but it can also explain ideas the audience already understands. Meet Joe Black constantly walks that line. Sometimes it finds something profound on the other side. Sometimes it falls directly into excess. Understanding the movie means being willing to acknowledge both. The story's origins help explain why the film feels simultaneously familiar and strangely expanded. Meet Joe Black is loosely connected to a much older tradition in which death takes human form to experience mortal life. The lineage reaches back to the Italian play La Morte in Vacanza, and the concept was adapted into the 1934 film Death Takes a Holiday. In those earlier versions, the basic fantasy already contained the essential contradiction. An immortal figure temporarily enters a world governed by mortality and discovers that human existence is more complicated than expected. Martin Brest's 1998 interpretation takes that foundation and stretches it into a sprawling romantic family drama. This is important because Brest was not an unknown filmmaker experimenting without a track record. Before Meet Joe Black, he had directed major successes including Beverly Hills Cop and Midnight Run, and he had also directed Scent of a Woman, a performance-driven drama that earned major acclaim. His reputation gave the project a certain prestige. The idea was not simply to make a supernatural romance. It was to create an expansive adult film about mortality, wealth, family, business, desire, and love, with enough visual grandeur to justify a major theatrical production. That ambition shaped almost every creative decision. Death would not arrive as an ominous skeletal figure. Instead, he would appear through the body of a beautiful young man, making him immediately attractive to Susan while remaining internally inexperienced. Brad Pitt was therefore asked to play a fascinating contradiction. He had to be charismatic enough to make the premise of Susan's attraction believable, yet strange enough to suggest that the consciousness inside the body had never been human. Joe's awkwardness is essential to the concept. He does not initially understand ordinary social behavior. He observes people with the curiosity of someone seeing the world for the first time. He can repeat words without understanding their emotional meaning. He can experience pleasure without understanding why humans value it. He is not stupid. He is simply inexperienced in a way no human being could ever be. Anthony Hopkins provides the opposite energy. Bill Parrish is someone who knows exactly how the world works. He understands business, etiquette, family dynamics, manipulation, social expectations, and mortality. Yet the more Joe learns about humanity, the more Bill is forced to confront what he has forgotten. That makes the relationship between them more important than the romance might initially suggest. Joe is not simply a supernatural visitor staying in Bill's house. He becomes Bill's final student, and Bill becomes Death's guide to humanity. The screenplay, involving Ron Osborne, Jeff Reno, Kevin Wade, and Bo Goldman, expands the premise considerably beyond a simple supernatural encounter. The project was also large in physical scale, with extensive production design, major locations, elaborate costumes, and a star-heavy cast. The production became known as an enormous undertaking, and that scale matters because the movie's central idea is actually extremely intimate. At its core, the film requires a man to talk to death. Everything else is decoration around that conversation. The mansion, the boardroom, the parties, the corporate conflict, the romance, the city, the food, and the music all exist around the same philosophical center. That contrast between intimate premise and massive production is one of the film's defining characteristics. It wants to make a quiet existential question feel like an event movie. Whether that works depends almost entirely on how willing the viewer is to surrender to its rhythm. The late 1990s cultural environment made that gamble especially interesting. Brad Pitt was already a major star, possessing the kind of celebrity power that could make an unusual project commercially attractive. Anthony Hopkins carried a different kind of prestige, particularly following performances that had established him as one of the defining dramatic actors of his generation. Claire Forlani was tasked with carrying the emotional center of the romantic story as Susan, a character whose attraction to Joe is complicated from the beginning by the fact that she has already encountered the body he inhabits. On paper, the combination of Pitt, Hopkins, and Forlani suggested a prestige romance with supernatural elements. But Meet Joe Black was stranger than that description. It was not primarily a conventional love story. It was a meditation on mortality that happened to contain a love story. It was also a family drama and a corporate drama, and the combination created a marketing problem. Was audiences supposed to come for Brad Pitt's romance? Anthony Hopkins' dramatic performance? A fantasy about death? A philosophical story? A wealthy family fighting over a corporation? The movie contained all of those elements, but no single description could completely contain it. Its reported production budget of roughly $90 million made the risk even greater. This was not a cheap experiment. Hollywood was spending blockbuster-level money on an adult drama built around long conversations and mortality. That contradiction would eventually become central to the movie's commercial story. Released in November 1998, Meet Joe Black arrived during a period of enormous cultural fascination with the future. The new millennium was approaching. Technology was accelerating. Wealth and celebrity culture were becoming increasingly visible. People were thinking about what the future would look like and whether the coming century would fundamentally change human existence. In that atmosphere, a film about death arriving in the home of a wealthy businessman was oddly appropriate. Bill Parrish represents a world that believes it can control almost everything. He has built systems, accumulated wealth, established relationships, and created an environment where problems can usually be solved through intelligence or money. But death is the one problem that refuses negotiation. And that makes Joe's arrival more disruptive than any corporate threat. Drew can attempt a takeover. Bill can fight Drew. Lawyers can negotiate. Employees can be reassured. But nobody can negotiate with the end itself. The film therefore establishes its central conflict before the supernatural premise has even fully developed. Bill's problem is not that he lacks power. His problem is that he has reached the boundary of power. The opening act begins with Bill Parrish preparing to celebrate his 65th birthday, and that number carries enormous symbolic weight. Birthdays are usually associated with accumulation. Another year lived, another year survived, Another year added to a person's story. But here the birthday becomes a reminder that the number is also moving in the opposite direction. Bill is 65, and death has decided to make the appointment personal. Yet before the supernatural interruption, the film spends considerable time establishing Bill as a man who appears comfortable in his own existence. He is successful, wealthy, socially confident, and deeply connected to his daughter Susan. Their relationship is one of the most important emotional foundations of the movie, because Susan is not merely Bill's child. She is the person who represents the future he will have to leave behind. Bill can imagine his company continuing without him. He can imagine employees adapting. He can imagine his wealth being distributed. But Susan's life is more difficult to detach from. She is intelligent, compassionate, independent, and perceptive, and she sees through some of the social performances surrounding her father's world. Her relationship with Bill has warmth without being sentimental, and that warmth makes the coming separation matter. Susan's own romantic life is initially less certain. Then she encounters a young man in a coffee shop. Their interaction is brief, almost frustratingly brief, but it becomes one of the film's most important structural devices. She is attracted to him immediately, and the movie allows that attraction to exist before either character has time to develop a conventional relationship. This is crucial because the young man's identity will later become the central complication of the romance. After the coffee shop encounter, the young man dies in a traffic accident. The sequence is sudden and brutal precisely because the film has not given the audience enough time to treat him as a conventional character. He is not introduced so that we can learn his biography. He is introduced so that Susan can meet him, feel something, and then lose him. His body becomes the vessel through which death enters the human world. That creates an unusual question about identity from the very beginning. If the body remains but the consciousness changes, who is Susan actually seeing? The physical face belongs to the man she met. The personality does not. And yet the emotional memory of the encounter remains attached to that face. This ambiguity becomes increasingly uncomfortable as Joe develops feelings for Susan. Death approaches Bill privately, and the movie immediately avoids the obvious route. There is no grand supernatural spectacle. Instead, death appears as a consciousness with an almost childlike curiosity. Bill is understandably terrified, but the terror quickly becomes philosophical. Death has come with a proposal. Bill will be allowed additional time, but in exchange he must become a guide. Joe wants to experience humanity. He wants to understand what people do, what they feel, why they behave as they do. Bill is therefore offered something impossible: more time but not freedom. His remaining days have a purpose assigned by the being who controls their endpoint. This transforms Bill's birthday into a countdown. Every conversation, every meal, every business meeting, every family interaction now carries a different weight because Bill knows what nobody else knows. Susan believes her father is preparing for another birthday celebration. Bill knows he is preparing for a farewell. The dramatic irony is immediate and powerful. Joe does not understand humanity. Bill understands humanity too well to ignore what is happening. Joe begins his education by encountering the most basic elements of human life. Food becomes one of the first revelations. For a being who has never possessed a human body, taste is not simply a pleasure. It is information. Peanut butter becomes almost comic, because Joe's fascination with it reveals how radically different his experience is. Humans rarely think about the miracle of taste because they encounter it every day. Joe does not. He approaches food with the intensity of someone discovering an entirely new sense. The same thing happens with language, social customs, personal space, humor, attraction, and physical sensation. Bill becomes his teacher, explaining things that ordinary people learn gradually and unconsciously. The relationship can be funny, but it is also strangely intimate. Bill is teaching Death how to be human while knowing that Death will eventually take him. There is something almost parental about it. Joe's dependence on Bill creates a dynamic in which the father becomes mentor to the ultimate outsider. And as Joe enters human society, Susan sees him again. The resemblance to the man she encountered in the coffee shop is immediate and emotionally disruptive. She does not understand why the same face seems to belong to a completely different person. Joe, meanwhile, cannot initially explain the difference because he does not possess the vocabulary for it. He knows himself as Joe Black. He does not understand the human significance of the body he is wearing. While Joe learns the language of human emotion, another conflict develops around Bill's professional life. Drew, a man operating within Bill's corporate world, begins maneuvering for greater power. Drew represents a different kind of human intelligence. Unlike Joe, Drew understands human systems. He knows ambition, competition, business strategy, and institutional power. But he does not use that knowledge to become more compassionate. He uses it to gain control. This creates one of the film's most interesting contrasts. Joe begins with almost no understanding of humanity and slowly discovers empathy. Drew begins with complete knowledge of humanity's systems and gradually reveals how little empathy he possesses. Death becomes more human while a human being becomes more death-like through greed. The contrast is not subtle, but it is conceptually useful. Bill's birthday party becomes a temporary illusion of control. Everyone gathers under one roof. The family appears intact. The company appears stable. Bill remains the charismatic center. But beneath the celebration, everything is shifting. Death is in the house. The corporation is threatened. Susan is becoming emotionally entangled with Joe. And Bill's remaining time is running out. The party is therefore both celebration and pre-funeral. It is life pretending that nothing is ending. As Joe becomes more comfortable in the human world, his education changes from intellectual to emotional. Knowing that people experience pleasure is different from experiencing pleasure. Knowing that people fall in love is different from feeling attraction. Knowing that humans become jealous is different from becoming jealous yourself. Joe begins to cross that boundary. He starts experiencing taste, pleasure, embarrassment, curiosity, desire, possessiveness, anger, and vulnerability. This is where the film's premise becomes more interesting than a simple death learns to live story. Joe is not merely collecting human experiences like souvenirs. Those experiences begin changing him. He develops an emotional relationship with Susan, and that relationship creates the movie's deepest ethical problem. Susan is attracted to the man she met before his death, but the person she now encounters is Joe. The body is familiar while the personality is not. The face carries one emotional history while the consciousness carries another. Joe's attraction to Susan is therefore both sincere and troubling. He is experiencing something new, but he is experiencing it through a body that already had a connection with her. The film never completely resolves the philosophical implications of this situation, and that ambiguity is part of why the romance can feel simultaneously moving and uncomfortable. Bill sees what is happening before Susan does. His protective instincts intensify. He knows Joe is death. He knows Susan is vulnerable. He knows Joe does not understand the consequences of human attachment. And he knows his own time is limited. The more Joe becomes emotionally involved with Susan, the more Bill's role changes from teacher to father trying to protect his daughter. Yet he cannot simply forbid Joe from feeling. That would contradict the very purpose of Joe's human education. If Joe is supposed to understand humanity, he must eventually experience the emotions that make humanity difficult. Love cannot be taught as a definition. It must be lived. That is the paradox Bill faces. To teach Death why human life matters, he has to allow Death to experience the pain that makes human life meaningful. The corporate conflict develops in parallel, because Bill's fear of losing control exists on two levels. He is losing control of his company, and he is losing control of his life. Drew's betrayal is therefore more than a business subplot. It reflects the same fundamental anxiety. Bill has spent decades building something he believes will outlast him. But what does legacy mean when the person who built the legacy is no longer there to experience it? The company can continue. The mansion can remain. The wealth can be distributed. The name can survive. Yet Bill himself cannot possess any of those things after death. This distinction becomes increasingly important as the story moves forward. Bill's business empire initially seems enormous. But as his deadline approaches, its importance begins shrinking. The things that once seemed permanent become temporary. The things that once seemed small become enormous. A conversation with Susan can matter more than a boardroom victory. A meal can matter more than a contract. A moment of silence can matter more than a financial negotiation. Joe's education is therefore also Bill's re-education. At the midpoint, the emotional contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Joe is beginning to understand love, but understanding love means discovering attachment, and attachment means discovering fear. An immortal being has no reason to fear losing someone, because the concept of permanent loss has no personal meaning. Human beings do not simply love. They love while knowing that the object of their love can disappear. That knowledge creates urgency. Joe begins to experience that urgency. Susan becomes important to him not merely because she is beautiful or because he is fascinated by her, but because he begins to understand that he could lose her. This is a crucial development. Desire says, "I want this." Love eventually has to confront the possibility, "I may not be able to keep this." Joe has been learning to possess human experiences. Now he must learn that some experiences cannot be possessed. Bill's desperation increases because he fears what Joe's attachment might mean for Susan. Joe has power that ordinary humans cannot understand. If Death wants something, what happens when human desire stands in the way? Bill cannot fight Joe physically or negotiate with him through conventional means. His only hope is to make Joe understand the emotional reality of what he is doing. Again, Bill must become the teacher. The mansion itself begins to feel more isolated as the story progresses. Its huge rooms, corridors, doors, and windows create an atmosphere of separation. The family is surrounded by wealth, but enclosed within a private world where an impossible secret exists. Outside, ordinary life continues. Inside, time is running differently. The birthday approaches. Bill's deadline approaches. Susan's emotional confusion intensifies. Joe's humanity deepens. The apparent stability of the parish household becomes increasingly fragile. The final act brings these threads together by forcing each character to confront the thing they have been avoiding. Bill must accept that his time cannot be extended indefinitely. Joe must understand that experiencing humanity, does not mean possessing everything humans possess. Susan must confront the emotional reality of loving someone who cannot remain with her in the form she expects. And the young man whose body Joe has occupied must become part of the resolution, because the story cannot completely separate identity from physical existence. Bill's birthday celebration transforms fully into a farewell. The man who began the film surrounded by control now has to practice release. That is the true climax. The movie does not build toward Bill defeating death. It builds toward Bill accepting death without surrendering the meaning of his life. Joe's final development depends on understanding sacrifice. At the beginning, he approaches humanity almost like a tourist. He wants to see, taste, touch, hear, and experience. But human life is not a collection of pleasures. It is a network of attachments, obligations, losses, memories, and choices. To love someone is to accept that you cannot guarantee their future. To have a family is to accept that the family will continue after you are gone. To build a company is to accept that somebody else may eventually control it. To live is to accept that the ending cannot be negotiated. Joe's final lesson is therefore not how to live forever. It is why humans cannot live forever and still experience time in the same way. The final walk carries this philosophy without requiring the story to turn into a conventional romantic ending. Joe's decision regarding Susan matters because he finally understands that love can require letting go. The young man's body can return to the human world, allowing the physical identity that Susan originally encountered to exist independently of Joe's supernatural consciousness. Bill can leave. Susan can grieve and continue. Joe can return to the realm from which he came, carrying knowledge he did not possess before. The ending is bittersweet because nobody receives everything they want. Bill does not get more life. Susan does not simply get Joe. Joe does not get to keep humanity. Yet something has been gained. Death has learned what life costs. Bill has learned that control cannot protect him from mortality. Susan has learned that love and loss are not opposites. They are connected. That is why Bill Parrish becomes the emotional protagonist of the film, even though Joe provides the supernatural premise. Bill's public identity is built around confidence. He is a successful businessman, a charismatic host, a respected employer, and a father accustomed to solving problems. His wealth creates an environment in which inconvenience can often be eliminated. If something needs to be repaired, repaired. If a business problem appears, negotiate. If a person needs assistance, provide it. But death is not an inconvenience. Death cannot be purchased away. Bill's greatest psychological wound is therefore not simply fear of dying. It is fear of losing the people he loves and leaving them without him. His surface goal is to preserve his company and legacy. His deeper goal is to preserve his family. The conflict between those goals becomes increasingly important because the movie asks whether legacy is really the thing people should fight hardest to protect. Bill initially responds to Joe with fear because death represents the one force he cannot control. Yet as the days pass, fear becomes curiosity and curiosity becomes responsibility. Bill begins teaching Joe. That teaching process forces Bill to articulate the value of things he may have taken for granted. Why does food matter? Why does love matter? Why does family matter? Why should a human being care about another person's feelings? Why is loss painful? Bill knows these things emotionally, but Joe's questions force him to examine them intellectually. In explaining humanity to death, Bill becomes more conscious of his own humanity. The teacher becomes a student. The man who believed he understood life discovers that he has not always lived according to what he understands. Bill's transformation is therefore not about becoming less successful. It is about changing the scale by which success is measured. Early in the story, his company is part of his identity. Near the end, it becomes secondary. Early in the story, his birthday is a social event. Near the end, it becomes a final gathering. Early in the story, time is something he spends. Near the end, time is something he feels. This is why his acceptance of death matters. Acceptance is not surrender. Bill does not decide that life has no value because it ends. He discovers the opposite. Life has value precisely because it cannot be kept. Joe is harder to classify because he begins as an apparent antagonist and gradually becomes something closer to a protagonist. He is death, but death is not presented as evil. Death is inevitable. Joe's initial lack of morality is less cruelty than ignorance. He does not understand why certain actions would be considered selfish because he has never lived inside human consequences. He is fascinated by pleasure because pleasure is new. He becomes jealous because jealousy is new. He becomes possessive because possession is new. The danger is not that Joe is malicious. The danger is that he does not yet understand limits. Human morality depends partly on recognizing that other people are as real as you are. Joe has to learn that recognition. Drew provides the inverse journey. Drew understands people, institutions, contracts, corporate structures, ambition, and competition. He knows how human systems operate and uses that knowledge to advance himself. Joe begins without humanity and learns empathy. Drew possesses humanity but suppresses empathy. This makes Drew more than a conventional corporate villain. He becomes a thematic counterpoint to Joe. One character has supernatural power, but must learn responsibility. The other has ordinary human power but chooses exploitation. One is learning why other people's feelings matter. The other treats other people as instruments. Through this contrast, the film suggests that being human biologically is not the same as behaving humanely. Susan occupies the emotional space between these two worlds. She is not simply a romantic prize waiting for Joe. She is the person through whom the film tests whether attraction can survive uncertainty about identity. Her relationship with Bill establishes her as emotionally grounded before Joe enters the story. She understands her father, even when she does not understand everything he is hiding. Her attraction to Joe is immediate, but the movie deliberately complicates it by making the audience aware that Joe is not the man she originally met. That creates a tension the film never completely resolves. Is Susan attracted to a face, a personality, a memory, a feeling, or some combination of all four? The question matters because Meet Joe Black repeatedly separates body from consciousness. The body looks human. The consciousness is not. Yet the consciousness gradually becomes more human through experience. Susan therefore becomes part of Joe's education. Through her, attraction becomes intimacy, intimacy becomes attachment, and attachment becomes vulnerability. Allison and Quince provide family continuity and ordinary warmth. Their presence prevents the story from becoming an isolated philosophical debate between Bill and Joe. They remind the audience that Bill's life exists within a network of people who have histories with him. The same is true of the employees and board members. Bill's death will not simply remove a character. It will change an ecosystem. That is one reason the supporting cast matters. Death is always experienced individually, but its consequences are social. One person's absence becomes another person's memory. The film's themes become clearer when we stop treating mortality as the villain. The primary theme is not simply death. It is meaning. Mortality creates boundaries, and boundaries create value. If there were infinite birthdays, birthdays would not have the same emotional significance. If every conversation could happen again tomorrow without consequence, we might not listen carefully today. If every person we loved were guaranteed to remain forever, love would lose some of its urgency. This does not mean death is good. The film does not make that simplistic claim. Instead, it suggests that the knowledge of death changes how we experience life. The finite nature of existence gives ordinary moments weight. Joe's education makes this visible because he notices things humans have stopped noticing. Coffee is not merely coffee. Food is not merely food. Music is not merely background. Touch is not merely physical contact. Conversation is not merely information exchange. For Joe, each sensation is new. For humans, familiarity makes sensation invisible. We become accustomed to the things that once amazed us. That is one of the film's most accessible ideas for modern viewers. People often postpone happiness because they assume there will be time later. Later becomes next month. Next month becomes next year. Work comes first. Money comes first. Responsibilities come first. Relationships wait. Rest waits. Joy waits. And then time becomes the one thing that cannot be rescheduled. Bill's wealth becomes especially important here. He can purchase comfort, but he cannot purchase additional ownership of time. He can create beautiful surroundings, but he cannot prevent them from eventually becoming someone else's surroundings. He can build a legacy, but he cannot remain present to enjoy it forever. Wealth magnifies the illusion of control because it removes many ordinary obstacles. But mortality does not care about wealth. Death is the great equalizer. The mansion and the traffic accident exist in the same universe. The billionaire and the stranger on the street are equally mortal. Joe enters Bill's world as a reminder that there is one boundary money cannot cross. The visual symbolism reinforces this idea. The parish mansion functions almost like a kingdom. It is enormous, elegant, carefully maintained, and filled with objects that suggest permanence. Yet its very size sometimes makes it feel empty. Large rooms create distance. Corridors become thresholds. Doors separate private lives from public performances. Windows allow characters to observe the outside world while remaining protected inside. The mansion is therefore both sanctuary and prison. It protects Bill from ordinary discomfort, while reminding him that no physical structure can protect him from death. Warm lighting and darkness repeatedly create contrasts. Joe's presence often carries a strange stillness, while the human world around him is warmer and more chaotic. Coffee becomes a recurring symbol of ordinary pleasure. Food becomes a sensory metaphor for existence itself. Birthday cake becomes a reminder of time passing. Candles are especially appropriate because they contain both celebration and extinction. They burn brightly precisely because they are being consumed. The same is true of a human life. The light exists because the fuel is disappearing. Mirrors and reflections become useful in a story about identity. Joe looks like the young man Susan met, but he is not the same person. The reflection is familiar while the consciousness behind it is different. Clothing similarly becomes part of Joe's adaptation. He learns how humans present themselves, how appearance communicates status and intention, and how a body becomes part of social identity. Yet the more successfully Joe performs humanity, the more the film asks whether performance can become genuine transformation. The traffic sequence establishes the visual language of mortality early. Human beings move quickly through the world without realizing how fragile their bodies are. Cars, roads, crowds, and urban movement represent a world operating at a speed death does not need to follow. Joe's stillness contrasts with that movement. He does not initially possess the same relationship to physical danger. But once he becomes emotionally attached, danger changes meaning. A being who cannot fear loss begins to discover why humans fear it. The cinematography, associated with Emmanuel Lubezki, contributes heavily to the film's dreamlike atmosphere. Soft lighting, warm interiors, elegant compositions, wide shots of architecture, and intimate close-ups create a world that often feels more like memory than conventional fantasy. That quality is important because the movie is constantly hovering between reality and allegory. The mansion feels real enough to inhabit, yet its scale and lighting make it feel almost unreal. The characters speak ordinary language, yet they are discussing extraordinary questions. The film's visual beauty sometimes compensates for narrative slowness, and sometimes makes that slowness more noticeable. The camera is patient because the story wants the viewer to feel time passing rather than simply understand that it is passing. Underneath the romance, the film asks one of its most complicated philosophical questions. What makes a person a person? Is identity consciousness? Is it memory? Is it the body? Is it experience? Is it morality? Joe possesses a human body but not its original identity. Yet he gradually develops human emotions through experience. The young man whose body he occupies has physical continuity, but loses his original consciousness. Susan's attraction therefore becomes a philosophical problem disguised as a romantic one. She recognizes the face, but the person behind the face has changed. Joe, meanwhile, begins to develop an identity of his own. The body was borrowed. The consciousness was supernatural. The emotions become increasingly human. Where exactly does the person begin? The film's answer is deliberately incomplete. Perhaps identity is not one thing. Perhaps it is the accumulation of memory, sensation, choice, relationship, and consciousness. Joe's transformation suggests that humanity is not merely a biological condition, but the film also refuses to claim that a supernatural being can simply become human by copying human behavior. Joe's greatest lesson comes through limitation. He discovers that desire without consequence is not enough. Pleasure without vulnerability is not enough. Experience without loss is not enough. Meaning requires stakes. This is why the production itself becomes an interesting subject. Meet Joe Black is a live-action fantasy, so its visual effects challenge is different from that of animation or spectacle-heavy fantasy. The movie does not need to create a constantly visible supernatural world. Joe's supernatural nature is communicated primarily through performance, framing, atmosphere, and contrast. Brad Pitt's stillness becomes a visual device. He often appears physically present, but emotionally disconnected from ordinary human rhythm. He watches people. He pauses before reacting. He processes sensations slowly. This makes him feel slightly outside the world even when he is standing in the middle of it. The principal residence, associated with the Aldrich Mansion in Rhode Island, gives the film an architectural environment large enough to support its sense of wealth and isolation. Dante Ferretti's production design turns the house into more than a location. It becomes a physical representation of Bill's world. Everything is spacious, controlled, elegant, and carefully arranged. Yet the larger the rooms become, the more visible the emotional distances can feel. Characters can stand only a few feet apart and still seem separated by entire worlds. Costume design similarly helps Joe adapt. Clothing becomes another language he has to learn. Humans use appearance to communicate identity, status, confidence, professionalism, and attractiveness. Joe initially possesses none of that instinctively. He learns it through observation. The transformation is therefore subtle. The film does not need supernatural effects to show that Death is changing. It simply lets him become more comfortable inside human rituals. The camera's patience is one of Martin Brest's most consequential choices. Conventional commercial cinema often compresses conversations to their essential information. Brest frequently does the opposite. He allows pauses to remain. He allows reactions to continue. He gives Anthony Hopkins room to dominate scenes through performance rather than action. Brad Pitt's strange restraint becomes more pronounced because the camera stays with him. Claire Forlani's quieter emotional style has space to develop. The mansion becomes a theatrical stage where characters frequently stand, sit, walk, pause, and speak rather than chase, fight, or perform conventional action. This is where the film begins to resemble an enormous stage play translated into cinema. That can be an asset when the performances are strong. Hopkins can make a pause meaningful. A look can carry an entire paragraph. A conversation can become a confrontation simply because the actors understand the emotional stakes. But the same strategy can become exhausting when the dialogue repeats ideas that the audience already understands. Brest's greatest strength is also the source of the movie's greatest weakness. He trusts time. Sometimes that trust produces immersion. Sometimes it produces excess. The question is whether the movie needed to be nearly 3 hours. The honest answer is probably that a significantly shorter version would have improved its narrative efficiency. But would it have improved the experience? That is harder to answer. Meet Joe Black is not merely long because the plot contains a lot of events. It is long because the film wants the audience to inhabit a mood. That distinction does not excuse every slow scene, but it explains the artistic intention. The movie is trying to make the viewer feel the weight of time, rather than simply move through a sequence of plot points. Thomas Newman's score is essential to that atmosphere. His music gives emotional architecture to scenes that might otherwise feel static. Rather than constantly announcing supernatural danger, the score creates warmth, melancholy, wonder, and anticipation. Piano textures and orchestral colors make Joe's experience feel intimate rather than terrifying. The music does not treat Death as a horror character. It treats him as an outsider entering a world of beauty he has never experienced. The score is particularly effective because Joe's dialogue is sometimes deliberately limited. He does not always know what he is feeling, and the music can communicate what the character cannot articulate. It becomes an emotional translator. A scene may contain little physical action, but the score tells the audience that something important is happening beneath the surface. Repetition also matters. Musical ideas return with different emotional meanings as the characters change. What begins as curiosity can later sound like longing. What begins as romance can later sound like loss. Silence is equally important. The movie's soundscape is not constantly filled with music. Traffic, footsteps, conversations, dishes, food, doors, parties, and household noises remind us that Joe is entering a world defined by sensory overload. The opening traffic sequence is especially important because it contrasts urban chaos with the controlled environment of the parish mansion. Outside, humanity moves quickly and noisily. Inside, everything is slower, quieter, and more controlled. For Joe, ordinary sounds become discoveries. Eating produces sound. Coffee involves movement, smell, heat, taste, and small rituals. Parties contain dozens of conversations happening simultaneously. Humans are surrounded by noise so constantly that they rarely notice it. Joe does. His education is therefore partly auditory. He is learning what human life sounds like. The absence of exaggerated supernatural effects makes the concept more believable. Joe does not need thunder whenever death appears. His otherness exists in the silence around his reactions. As Bill approaches death, the soundscape becomes quieter. That reduction matters because the story is moving from external life toward internal acceptance. The party noise becomes less important. The corporate conflict becomes less important. What remains are voices, footsteps, music, and eventually the feeling that time itself is narrowing. When Meet Joe Black was released in November 1998, the response exposed a major divide between ambition and execution. The movie opened with approximately $15 million domestically, demonstrating substantial curiosity around its stars and premise. But the critical response was mixed. Critics frequently focused on the runtime, pacing, dialogue, and romantic awkwardness. The movie was almost 3 hours long, and many reviewers felt that its ideas could have been expressed more effectively in a shorter film. Others appreciated the performances, cinematography, atmosphere, and ambition. That divide became even more interesting when audience response was considered. Rotten Tomatoes currently records a 48% critic score against an 81% audience score, while Metacritic lists a 43 critic score. Those numbers do not prove that the audience was right and critics were wrong. They demonstrate something more useful. The movie was experienced differently depending on what viewers wanted from it. A critic evaluating narrative economy could reasonably object to the length. A viewer attracted to romantic atmosphere and philosophical themes could reasonably find the same length immersive. This is one of the most important distinctions in discussing Meet Joe Black. Popularity and critical quality are not identical measurements. A movie can be structurally flawed and emotionally meaningful. It can be beautiful and frustrating. It can contain weak dialogue and strong performances. It can be overlong and still contain scenes worth remembering. The film's reputation became shaped by that contradiction. People remembered Brad Pitt. They remembered the coffee shop. They remembered the peanut butter. They remembered the mansion. They remembered the final walk. And they also remembered how long the movie was. Over time, the home viewing environment changed the way the film could be experienced. In a theater, nearly 3 hours requires a particular level of commitment. At home, the viewer has more control. The film can be watched privately, paused, revisited, or experienced in a more relaxed environment. Modern streaming culture has also made audiences more accustomed to long-form storytelling. Films exceeding 2.5 hours are no longer automatically treated as extraordinary. That does not erase the movie's pacing problems, but it changes the context in which those problems are experienced. The film developed an unusual afterlife because it never became a dominant franchise, but it never completely disappeared either. Certain scenes became recognizable cultural references. Joe's fascination with peanut butter became a humorous symbol of his alien relationship with ordinary life. The coffee shop encounter remained important because it established the romantic premise in such a small amount of screen time. The mansion became part of the movie's visual identity. The final sequence remained memorable because it refuses to give the audience a conventional romantic reward. That makes Meet Joe Black difficult to classify as either a conventional cult film or a forgotten failure. It is something stranger, a film that continues to provoke disagreement. Some viewers see a beautiful meditation on mortality. Others see an overlong romantic fantasy buried under excessive dialogue. Some admire Brad Pitt's intentionally alien performance. Others find it stiff. Some find the movie emotionally sincere. Others find its philosophy too obvious. The fact that all of these interpretations can coexist is part of its lasting fascination. The critics versus audience divide becomes especially revealing when we examine the film's strongest criticisms. The most obvious is length. 3 hours is not inherently a problem. Many great films are long. The issue is whether the material earns the time. Meet Joe Black sometimes repeats emotional information. Joe asks questions that have already been answered. Characters revisit conflicts that the audience understands. The business storyline occasionally competes with the supernatural romance instead of strengthening it. Susan's emotional arc can feel underdeveloped compared with the amount of attention given to Joe and Bill. Drew's corporate villainy is comparatively conventional beside the movie's more unusual supernatural ideas. Brad Pitt's performance is another point of division. His approach is deliberately strange. Joe is not supposed to behave like a normal person. He is a being learning human behavior from observation. That means pauses, stiffness, limited vocabulary, and unusual physicality are part of the concept. But there is a risk in this strategy. Awkwardness can be interpreted as profundity simply because the character is supposed to be mysterious. The performance works best when Joe's unfamiliarity reveals something about humanity. It works less effectively when his limited expression simply slows the scene. The romance with Susan creates the movie's most persistent ethical question. Joe is inhabiting another person's body. Susan has already met that person. Her attraction is therefore entangled with physical recognition. The film wants the audience to accept that Joe's feelings are becoming genuine, but it also asks us to overlook a deeply strange identity problem. Whether that problem is a flaw or an intentional philosophical complication depends on how much ambiguity the viewer is willing to accept. The movie never provides a simple answer because the entire story is built around the separation of body and self. The film's philosophical dialogue can also become too explicit. Sometimes the characters dramatize ideas through their behavior. At other times, they discuss those ideas directly. The difference is important. Cinema is usually strongest when philosophy emerges from action and character rather than appearing as an explanation. Meet Joe Black occasionally tells the audience what it wants them to think instead of trusting the images and performances to communicate the idea. That contributes to the perception of pretension. Its negative critical history also included a Razzie nomination for Worst Remake or Sequel, reflecting the degree to which some critics saw the movie's relationship to earlier material as unsuccessful. Yet criticism should not erase the distinction between unconventional filmmaking and incompetent filmmaking. Some of Meet Joe Black's strangest choices are deliberate. The question is not whether every choice succeeds. Clearly, many viewers believe they do not. The more interesting question is whether removing those choices would make the movie better or simply more conventional. Commercially, the movie presents another paradox. Against a reported production budget of roughly $90 million, it earned approximately $44.6 million domestically and around $98.3 million internationally. for a worldwide total of approximately $142.9 million. Those numbers mean the film was not simply an absolute financial disaster, but they also explain why its theatrical performance could be considered disappointing relative to its scale. A worldwide gross cannot be compared directly with production budget to calculate profit, because studios do not keep the entire box office, and marketing, distribution, and theater splits also affect the economics. The larger lesson for Hollywood was straightforward. Star power did not guarantee blockbuster performance. A famous director did not guarantee broad appeal. A supernatural premise did not automatically produce a high-concept commercial movie. A large budget could amplify both beauty and risk. Meet Joe Black was an expensive adult drama that asked mainstream audiences to slow down and contemplate mortality. That is a difficult product to market, particularly when the advertising must also communicate romance, fantasy, and celebrity. The film's lack of a major sequel ecosystem is therefore significant. Unlike franchises built around recognizable worlds, Meet Joe Black was fundamentally a standalone story. There was no obvious path toward sequels, spin-offs, or an expanding mythology. Death could return, but the premise depended on its emotional uniqueness. The movie's industry significance is consequently less about direct influence and more about what it illustrates. It is an example of late 1990s Hollywood's willingness to spend blockbuster-level money on original adult entertainment, even when the concept was difficult to categorize. Its historical importance comes from that unusual combination. The film connects the older Death Takes a Holiday tradition to the prestige filmmaking culture of the 1990s. It brings together Martin Brest, Brad Pitt, Anthony Hopkins, Claire Forlani, Thomas Newman, Emmanuel Lubezki, and Dante Ferretti in a project whose scale is almost disproportionate to its premise. It is a time capsule of a Hollywood willing to believe that an audience might spend nearly 3 hours watching death eat peanut butter, attend parties, fall in love, and discuss mortality inside a mansion. That sounds absurd when reduced to a sentence. Yet that absurdity is exactly what makes the movie interesting. It is not a franchise. It is not a conventional blockbuster. It is not a minimalist art film. It occupies an uncomfortable middle ground. It wants the scale of prestige cinema and the emotional intimacy of a chamber drama. It wants romance and philosophy. It wants spectacle without depending on spectacle. It wants death to be frightening without making him evil. And it wants the audience to feel time rather than simply watch a story about time. Some of those ambitions have aged better than others. The mortality theme remains powerful. The fear of wasting time remains universal. The parent-child relationship between Bill and Susan still carries emotional weight. The idea that love becomes more meaningful because it is temporary remains relevant. Anthony Hopkins' performance remains one of the film's strongest anchors. Thomas Newman's atmosphere and the cinematography continue to give the film a dreamlike identity. Other elements feel unmistakably tied to 1998. The corporate storyline belongs to a particular era of business culture. Some dialogue reflects the conventions of late 1990s prestige romance. The movie's pacing reflects a period when theatrical films could afford to be unusually expansive, without being divided into franchise installments. Its marketing depended heavily on celebrity. Even the way Susan's romantic situation is framed can feel dated to contemporary audiences more sensitive to questions of identity and consent. Yet age can change the meaning of the film rather than simply diminish it. A younger viewer may focus on Susan and Joe. A viewer in middle age may focus more on Bill. Someone obsessed with career may suddenly recognize the emptiness of Bill's corporate conflict. Someone who has experienced loss may understand the final act differently from someone watching it for the first time. That is the strange quality of mortality stories. The movie does not change, but the viewer does. And therefore the movie can become a different film at different stages of life. That may be the strongest argument for its rewatch value. Meet Joe Black is not necessarily better because you get older, but different things become visible. At first, Joe's education may seem like the central story. Later, Bill's acceptance may become more important. The romance may dominate one viewing, while the father-daughter relationship dominates another. The business conflict may seem irrelevant until you realize that Bill's obsession with legacy is part of his inability to accept impermanence. So where does that leave the film? The Ferris verdict is neither masterpiece nor failure. Meet Joe Black is flawed, sometimes frustrating, frequently beautiful, and unusually ambitious. Anthony Hopkins provides the emotional gravity. The cinematography creates an atmosphere that few mainstream films of its era attempted. Thomas Newman's score gives the story a dreamlike emotional language. The production design makes Bill's world feel almost mythological. The premise itself remains genuinely compelling. But the screenplay is uneven. The runtime is excessive. The romance contains ethical and emotional complications the movie does not fully resolve. The business subplot sometimes feels conventional. Brad Pitt's intentionally alien performance can either fascinate or irritate depending on the viewer. The problem is that these weaknesses cannot be completely separated from the ambition. The film is trying to be several movies at once. A romance, a fantasy, a family drama, a corporate drama, and a philosophical meditation on mortality. Some of those movies are stronger than others. The result is not a seamless masterpiece but a fascinating imperfect object. A 7 out of 10 experience feels more honest than either extreme. It is worth recommending to viewers who enjoy slow-burn fantasy romances, philosophical dramas, atmospheric filmmaking, and stories that are willing to sit with an idea longer than modern commercial cinema usually allows. It is less suitable for anyone expecting fast narrative momentum or a conventional supernatural romance. And perhaps that is exactly where the movie's greatest irony emerges. Death enters Bill Parrish's life expecting to learn what humans do with their limited existence. Joe wants to taste food, understand attraction, experience pleasure, and discover what makes humanity interesting. He approaches human life almost like an enormous museum. But the longer he stays, the more he realizes that the value of those experiences does not come from the sensations themselves. Coffee matters because there is someone to share it with. Food matters because memory can attach itself to taste. Music matters because it can remind us of people and moments. Touch matters because bodies are temporary. Conversation matters because people eventually become memories. Bill already knows these things, but he has not always lived as though he knows them. His final days force him to stop postponing. He spends time with family. He resolves unfinished business. He confronts betrayal. He prepares for his absence. Most importantly, he stops trying to turn extra time into permanent time. That is the lesson Joe ultimately learns. Humans do not receive value from having infinite time. They receive value from knowing that time is finite. And that idea reaches far beyond this particular movie. Modern audiences have more ways than ever to distract themselves from time. Work can consume entire days. Phones can consume hours. Algorithms can fill every silence. People can postpone relationships, rest, travel, creativity, and simple moments because they believe there will always be another opportunity. Another weekend. Another year. Another chance. But Meet Joe Black asks what happens when later suddenly disappears. Joe notices what humans ignore. He notices coffee. He notices food. He notices music. He notices touch. He notices conversation. He notices family. He notices love. The strange thing is that these are not extraordinary things. They are ordinary. That is precisely why they matter. Human beings do not usually lose their lives because they failed to experience enough spectacular moments. They lose time through thousands of ordinary moments they assume did not matter. That brings us back to the opening question. If death gave you extra time, what would you do with it? Would you work more? Protect your possessions? Win another argument? Expand your career? Accumulate another achievement? Or would you finally notice the things already surrounding you? Bill's answer is not immortality. He does not discover a way to defeat death. He does not transform his wealth into another lifetime. He simply learns to stop fighting the reality that his life has an ending. Joe, meanwhile, learns the opposite lesson from the one he expected. He does not learn how to make humans immortal. He learns why immortality would change the meaning of human experience. That is why the final image of Meet Joe Black lingers. Death came to learn what it means to live. And by the end, the audience is left with a more uncomfortable question. If death had to come to humanity to discover the value of ordinary life, how much of that value have we forgotten? Maybe that is why the film continues to divide people. Maybe some viewers see an overlong romance, while others see a philosophical fantasy disguised as one. Maybe it is both. Maybe its imperfections are inseparable from its desire to say too much. It wants to make us fall in love, contemplate mortality, question identity, examine wealth, think about family, and feel time passing. It does not accomplish all of those things equally well, but it attempts something increasingly rare. It asks the audience to slow down long enough to consider what a human life actually consists of. And perhaps the most important thing Bill learns is not that death is inevitable. He knew that already. What he learns is that inevitability does not make life meaningless. It makes the moments inside it matter. Nobody gets to keep all their time. Nobody gets to preserve every relationship, every possession, every achievement, or every beautiful moment. Eventually, everything becomes memory. The only question left is what we do with the time before it does. So perhaps Meet Joe Black is not really asking whether death can learn to live. Perhaps it is asking whether the living have remembered how. And that is what makes this strange, excessive, beautiful, frustrating film worth returning to. It may not be a perfect movie. It may not even be a perfectly constructed one. But few films are willing to spend this much time staring directly at the one subject every person eventually has to face. Death came expecting a lesson. Bill gave him one. And the audience is left to decide whether they have learned it too. Was Meet Joe Black a misunderstood masterpiece? An overlong romantic fantasy? A beautiful experiment that went too far? Or something somewhere between all three? Which scene stayed with you the longest, and did your interpretation of the film change as you got older? Because perhaps that is the final trick hidden inside its nearly 3-hour runtime. The movie asks us to spend time watching characters learn how valuable time is. The question is whether, when the credits finally roll, we remember to do the same.